Welcome to our Youth Parliamentary Network. We are having an exciting conversation with brilliant minds, and more importantly, we are celebrating 100 years of voting access in Trinidad and Tobago. It was the 7th of February, 1925, where we had the ability to have our voices being heard. So it would be remiss of us to not allow this century to pass us by not having the future of Trinidad and Tobago lend their voice, bring their views, and bring their solutions of what the next 100 years would look like. I want to just go straight into the introduction of everyone. So we have Faith Flavius, we have to her left, we have Janae Campbell, and then we have Chris Hussein, and we have our very well dressed and down in blue, we have Ashanta Sipasad, and then we have Mr. Shane John. My name is Mwale Henry. I'll be your moderator for today's conversation, and I invite you to put a comment in the chat. Give us feedback as you are part of this conversation, because you're in the room with us. So we want to talk a little bit about the history of this evolution. And this evolution is quite unique, moving from franchise voting to adult suffrage, and then the evolution of coming into independence and then Republican status. And at every interval, there were changes, social changes, behavioral changes, and access of that change. So Faith, tell us what that change was like then, and how do we fully appreciate that change?
Okay, so I think to appreciate, as you said, that change, we need to understand the context, right? So what we had in the colonial Trinidad and Tobago would have been the crown colony model. And this was where the monarch, under the monarch, there was the colonial secretary of state. Under that, there was the governor, and under the governor, there was the elective council. That elective council consisted of the plantocracy, or business owners, plantation owners, we're speaking within that context, as well as the elite of Trinidad and Tobago, right? So we are within that context, and on the other hand, there are the masses. There's those persons that are the working class, the emerging middle class. You have persons that are underrepresented, both men and women, different ethnic groups, different working backgrounds, right? So I like to draw reference to the water riots of 1903. And there you had one of the the biggest disputes, I would say, speaking about that political disaffection in Trinidad and Tobago, where you have the masses not being represented and not being able to vocalize their issues. So the water riots were disputes and taxes over water, and the masses' voices, they were not recognized. They were not, the bourgeois of Trinidad and Tobago, they disregarded the voices of the mass. And in turn, there was the water riots in 1903, and it ended up in the Red House, as we know now, being burnt down. Right? So it's amazing to see we are here a few 100 years later or more. But that is the most, I think, obvious and hallmark of the state of democracy, or lack thereof, at that time. And what you had following that was World War I. You also had Black consciousness and the emergence of that Black consciousness. And with that also this rise of nationalism with World War I. And what you saw at the end of World War I and also during was this rise in political awareness. You had labor movements, or what I call proto-trade unions, because they were not legalized as yet, but they worked with the British labor movement to understand how to form themselves into political unions for the masses and represent their voices.
So to your point, and what I'm hearing clearly, Faith, is there was a class issue, a
Yes.
class structure
Yes.
that created, a limitation for persons to
Yes.
have access for their voice.
Yes.
But let's also add to that, was there a social and ethnic division as well? Because when you look at that type of social disturbance, one of the key contexts is that there were other British colonies who had access to voting rights
Yes.
at that time.
Yes.
For instance, Canada, Australia.
Yes.
And what was the difference is they were
Yes.
not black
Yes.
or ethnic or
Yes.
non-white.
Yes.
So how do we see now, this access has limited, our evolution based on our ethnic separation or division? Tell us a little bit more about that from your perspective, Shane. What does that cultural, agitation that we saw then, and do we see semblance of that today?
Well, I think it's very important that we delve into that a bit deeper, because we're talking about 100 years since we were allowed to vote as Trinidad and Tobago. And when you look at the elections of 1925, as my colleague pointed out, and the social structure, one of the things for me in terms of preparing for this discussion is that you realize that some of the things that we experience today resembles that of 100 years ago. And specifically, I would speak to ethnicity. And in your elections of both 1925 as well as 1946, you had the issue where there was a big language barrier.
Right.
And it comes from both looking at slavery as well as indentureship, where the population or the majority of persons participating in indentureship, they would have spoken Hindi. And so the way persons would have voted then 100 years ago, or even in 1946, some of the persons or the lower class who could not have spoken English, the only way to reach to them was through their language. And you had some politicians at that point in time, clear language barrier, could not have spoken the language. And so when you fast forward to today and we talk about tribal and race politics, and so we see there's a particular, you talk about UNCMP and strongholds, and it mirrors that same movement in terms of your different electoral districts and so forth 100 years ago. And you ask yourself now as a young person, why is that still the case 100 years later? And so in terms of evolution, and it's very good for us to point out where we have reached and how we have grown. I mean, in 1946, you had the issues where you had persons being able to vote, and you only had women who could have voted at the age of 21, and then that would have changed, and persons would have been allowed to vote at the age of 21, compared to 1946 and 1925. Yes, it's a lot of numbers, but it talks about that transition, but some things have changed and improved,
right,
where you see there's more access now, and everyone is allowed to vote, majority of your population. But then in terms of the way the population has voted from years gone by, it looks similar to that of 100 years ago.
Thank you so much for that, Shane. So let's unpack that a little bit more as we look at our sister island, Tobago. From a historical evolution, Tobago has been a part of this journey with us, and in that journey, I want to get a little bit from you, Janae. What has that historical struggle been like, being first inculcated through that struggle? If you look at the west of Tobago, if you look at the east, what was some of the social upheavals that happened? And do we see a similar pattern in terms of franchise or voting patterns mirroring what took place in the past?
Okay, I actually love this question. So again, I would always say that the challenges that were faced by our counterparts in Trinidad can be comparative to the challenges experienced in Tobago, right? However, what I would argue is that Tobago populace has had a unique challenge in terms of fighting for our space and place in the national conversation, and that's why today we are having conversations about self-governance. In terms of certain upheavals that would have happened, there was the Belmana riots that happened in the year 1876, where you had persons being brought in from Barbados to work on the Roxborough Cocoa Estate, and having had to endure deplorable conditions, having been underpaid, having been undermined, those persons decided to riot, and they fought against the plantocracy because out of resistance you have triumph. And as a result of those riots, you had persons coming in from Britain to quell the situation and what I should say tend to the perils or the concerns of the workers then. And it all is linked to, we had our Butler riots in Trinidad as well. So you see that we have a culture of rioting for our rights. And so when you look at our landscape today, I would say to some extent we are a little more docile, I guess, because as we have evolved as a country in terms of persons now having access to a lot more things that they would have had access to then. So, persons, I wouldn't say that everybody is content with their salary, but you have more persons being able to be gainfully employed, and you have a lot more social mobility where you have the rise in the middle class, because I think back then you had a big disparity between the rich and the poor. Now, I would say we have a strong middle class, a middle class that can vote, a middle class that can work. So yes, both in Tobago and Trinidad, we all have overcome our challenges and have risen. And as we look at the political landscape then to now, I see room for Tobago in particularly to get some more, I don't want to say independence, because when you raise the issue of self-governance, persons think that
secession.
Yeah, persons automatically think secession, but I am pro Tobago's autonomy, greater decision-making capacity, the capacity to make your own laws, the capacity to get more income to run your own affairs. Because if you look at Tobago and Trinidad, you notice that there's a big developmental disparity when you look at the infrastructure available in Tobago. I just want to stick up in, most of Tobago's budgetary allocation is for recurrent expenditure. Recurrent expenditure is to pay salaries, maybe to maintain some roads. And what's the development? Just a mere couple $100 million, right? So that's something that I hope that we could overcome in the upcoming years.
Thank you so much, for sharing that perspective, Janae, because even as we are talking about our historical context and we're journeying through some of the class issues, some of the ethnic issues, race issues, even we're talking about economic access issues. Let's talk a little bit about the evolution of youth and also women as they have journeyed through this process, having access to voting. What has taken place with our Republican Constitution? What has taken place, from that movement of independence and the agitation, historical agitation we just talked about? So, for instance, Shanta, tell me a little bit about the role of women historically, and how do we see their role in this national conversation as we look back at 100 years, but more so what that change looks like for women?
When I looked at the history in 1925, for women to be able to vote, they had to be of age 30, which I think is a big grown woman. Men had to be of age 21. Apart from that, they had to own property and they had to prove their income as well. And looking at the history back then, I think that would have been a very difficult thing to do. So most women would not have had the opportunity to cast that vote. Now, when you look 100 years after, we have to appreciate how far we have come and how far women have come as well. I still believe there's a lot of room for women to participate, to be a part of the politics, but we have come a long way, and that is something that we truly have to appreciate. Now, where can we go? As I said, there's a lot more room. There's so many issues that affect women. Now, back in 1925, there were issues affecting women, but that was never brought to the forefront. It was a male-dominated society. Women, I don't want to say we were treated second class, but we knew the history then. When we look at issues now that affect women, such as period poverty, domestic violence, I think it's important that we have women in our parliaments to make decisions, to make policies on behalf of issues that affect women.
Beautiful. And even as we talk about that disparity historically, you know, you identified a difference in age, right? Men were at that, your counterparts were able to vote at 21, yet a higher standard was placed, you know, on women at age 30. They had a difference in proving their income. For men, you know, yes, you had to have a certain type of income, but it didn't state in your own. But when it came to women, you had to show and prove that your income status was generated by you and you alone.
Correct.
And let's look at how this historical change has taken place. We see the movement of workers, the rise of trade unionism in its sense, and then the access to women being able to vote, being able to add their voice. So we are in the parliament. This is a sacred place. I'm sure many of you are excited to be in this space, to have this type of conversation. And our first woman MP was Audrey Jeffers, 1950. She came into the parliament, and that was signaled the rise of something new. But I want to ask, in that change, where do we see the voice of young persons seeing that evolution, seeing that change, as we indicated before, not just a change in age, but now being called to a responsibility? So if you would, take us through a clear understanding of, number one, Chris, how do we see the role of youth then, that those fundamental changes legally and legislatively, and do we just touch a little bit, do we see that engagement there today?
Young people have always been at the forefront of political campaigns, historically and today. The age limit to be an elected member of parliament of the lower house is 18 years old. And if we look in the Senate, it's 25 years. Just recently, we had conversations about constitutional reform, and I think that is something that we need to look at again, yeah? Because the reality is that young people now are way more informed than they would have been a couple years ago. Throughout the 100 years of our parliament, successive governments would have ensured that education was a fundamental key to success for many young people. And so you have a more informed young person making a decision. But when I said that we are at the forefront of the political campaigns, I think it's in a tokenistic way. I think it's in a way in which we are there just because of our age. But when it comes to actually making the decision, we don't get to make the decision. And I find that flawed. And the reason I say I find that flawed, because many of the conversations that we should be having today about AI, climate change, renewables, Shanda raised some points on even period poverty, some of the persons making these decisions, quite frankly and respectfully, will not be here in 20 years to come. And so the legislation that we must be able, and the policy that we must be able to drive now, the reality is that we will all be a part of this nation. The debt will be our debt, that in which we will have to pay or for. The way we look at the economy right now, we are, we transitioned from more of an oil to gas, yeah? We transitioned, yeah, we diversified. But even in which we make our projections for the budget, that too is something that I think we will have to one day inherit in reading out the budget. Maybe Shane one day might be the Minister of Finance. You never know. So I think we have been at the forefront. I think it's a tokenistic way, but Gen Z voters is something very important. And many of us here, I think all of us here, are Gen Z voters. Or some of us here maybe, right? Right? But it's interesting because you have the introduction of technology now. You have social media. So anything you say, it is there. We get it in real time. And if you were to compare the way political messaging or messages are received now to then, you had to either attend the meeting in person or have a reporter go then under some tent in the dark with rain, and it was pavement meetings as well. And then they will scribe down whatever the meeting was about and then report it the next day. And from what I understand, it was two different stories sometimes, right?
But let me add to that conversation of the involvement of youth, or should I say non-youth historically, what it was like then and how it is now. I would contend that because youth and women and those who were poor or non-white were not a part of the electoral process, they were more engaged. Let me take you through this. Captain Cipriani, at that time when we had access to voting, when he was elected, T.M. Kelshaw, James Begat of Tobago, all right? The evolution of the Workmen's Association. Historically, what was recorded is that because they could not vote, they attended party, meetings. And not only did they attend in masses, they attended the opposing parties' meetings and jeered, and they created an uproar because they did not have access. So the political engagement historically at that time, I would contend, was a little more engaging. But what I would want to surmise is, do we think historically, now 100 years we're looking back, do we value the vote today? To you.
That's a very interesting question, and I think for the most part, as citizens of this country, I do not think we value the vote. I do not think that we have consideration for the strides that many of our ancestors had to endure, the fight for universal suffrage going back to 1925, when you had to own land, men aged 21 and women aged 30 alone was able to vote. Then in 1928, legislation was passed for women aged 21 who own property were able to vote, then to get adult suffrage in 1945. And it's always been a progressive strive, right? And looking at our generation in particular, I would say that there's a lot of political disenchantment. As young persons, a lot of persons feel disconnected to the political landscape. So you would hear young persons say they're not going to vote because the politicians don't do anything for them, they don't represent them adequately, and that is the concerns of youth. And what I would say to counteract that is politics is in all of us. Politics influences our living, your education, the things that you are passionate about as a young person. You may be interested in sport. Politics has a part to play in that in terms of the infrastructure available, the funding available for sport. So as young people generally, we need to take a more active role in politics to ensure that our concerns are met and we vote responsibly. Because I would tell you this, I really like to talk about Tobago, so let me just stick a pin on Tobago again. For the last THA election, what was very interesting is that a lot of young persons voted for the incumbent party, because at the time, the People's National Movement did not have that sway with the youth. And here comes Farley Chavez Augustine, who is seemingly young, well, not so young in my book, but young in politics. Here comes Farley Chavez Augustine and his team with a lot of youthful persons, Zia Hackett, Abby Taylor, and a host of others, and they had that sway. You would see Watson Duke going on the blocks, meeting and greeting with the young people, and these young people, they took a very active role and they voted. I'm not sure if they're going to vote for the next election, but I would say that while we have this challenge with young persons voting, we are evolving, and I can only hope that the voter turnout and the youth participation in politics only increases as time progresses.
And you've raised an interesting point, even as I listen to Chris really reflect on that evolution, and you use a very interesting word, tokenism, youth being seen as a tokenism, and yet still in a postmodern society, we still see some responsiveness, or evidence of responsiveness, and how that responsiveness or connectivity from the Tobago experience has evolved, and what lessons we can learn from that. So I want to expand the conversation, because we're talking about understanding the present and what voting is like and what this project of democracy as it evolves. Dr. Hollis Liverpool, as we know him as Chocolates, he always says this. He said, history is a mirror and it's like a tree. And in order to understand our future, we must understand the roots of where we stand. So answer this question for me, and this is going to be a jump ball, all right? Anyone could take a punch at this question. If you look at our present landscape, we're talking about young people. Why do you think, on a deeper level, young persons feel disengaged and disconnected to politics in an environment that has seen increased connectivity and communication? Jump ball.
If I can get a go at that first.
Sure.
Because Jenny and both Chris have been speaking about it. But I feel as though, our style of politics, to me, I don't think we engage enough as it relates to addressing issues pertaining to everyday life and everyday livelihoods when election time rolls around. And just comparatively, you look at the US election, and when they do their projections and so forth, you see how they engage young people, and it's done analytically. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have not identified in any election what is the percentage of young people voting. And so you ask yourself at the level of the EBC, why has the data not been produced to examine the percentage of persons under 30 to 18 persons, 30 to 45 voting, so that we can have a better understanding as to who vote. To directly answer your question in terms of why you think that persons are not engaged, when you look at the 1961 election, which was actually the election won before we became an independent nation, we had an 88% voter turnout. And it's the highest, and it's the one election that we have had so much persons voting. And you listen or you read the literature produced by then Prime Minister Eric Williams, and he spoke about his journey when he engaged in youth rallies. He had rallies for women. He had rallies for those that were working at Carney Limited. He had rallies for those living in Laventille. And he shared his story and his vision for the country. At each juncture, he engaged different sectors of society. Now it almost feels as though, yes, we have social media. Yes, we're using social media. But are we communicating to the young people? This is why you should vote. This is the reason why you should be engaged and so forth. So you actually had in 1961.
Is it that type of market segmentation that you talked about? Are political parties engaging an electorate to exercise their franchise from that perspective? What is in the interest of women? What is in the interest of youth in a meaningful way? So Chris, if you could touch on that, followed up by Faith, how do we see that communication? Is it intentional, or is it, as you would have said, surface level?
So I remembered in 2020, it was the first general election that I would have been able to vote in legally. And of course, I am trying to make an informed decision because it's exciting, you know, you get to stain the finger and we exist in the social media realm, so you want to post it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking on at the political offerings by many political actors and parties at that time. And what I found was missing or very much absent was substance. And that might be general, but substance that makes sense to me. Because it's contextual, right? I am a first-time voter. The interest at my age group is different to the interest that maybe in other age groups. And I want to believe that it may sometimes be intentional. It may sometimes be intentional because if you were to look at some of the elections, you had 1986 with 33.3. You had, even if we come down just a decade ago, from 2010, you had a voter turnout of 69 point something percent, roughly 70%. You go down to 2015, you come back up to 20. It has been dwindling. It has been less and less persons are interested in voting. And you must ask yourself, well, why? And so I asked myself, why? I mean, you had a local government election just recently. The voter turnout was 30.34%. But you look at the political hustings and you're hearing who win what, right? Yeah.
You win a minority.
Yeah,
right?
a lot of beating of chest. And it makes me wonder if sometimes this is a show for the press. Because as I said earlier on, there are a lot of issues. We have a foreign exchange crisis right now, in this country. We have an issue of crime in this country. Yet the conversation is very much of, well, that's not my job, or when you were there, you didn't do well enough. But where is the bipartisan approach? Because when you're elected into the House, it is understood that these 41 members are going to work together to be productive. And young people, as Shane said, our style of politics is very different. Because what you'll find in the youth space is there are many young people who belong to several political parties and some who don't subscribe to any.
Right.
And all of us exist, and all of us can still be friends. And all of us can have political discussion and debate, and it's a healthy, robust engagement. But then you look inside the parliament and you hear some very counterproductive things. The peacock to me is no longer peacock. I remembered, if you go on YouTube, because I would have been very small at that age when you looked at the peacock back in the day. The peacock now seems quite personal. I don't find it funny. I'm not laughing, right? Maybe I'm not the target audience, and maybe that may be it. So one of the things I look at with messengers and messaging is, who's your target audience? I don't think I am. And I think it may also be deliberate.
Okay, a very interesting take. So let's expand and expound on what was shared. Is it intentional to leave a segment of our voting population, or do we need to go back to our roots, as Chokda says? Because let's talk a little bit about what that historical fact is and what's possible for today. So you have, in 1966, the youngest, person who was elected into office at age 26, and that's Ainsley Hanuman Singh. He came in on the DLP. Do we see, let me put it this way, is there the possibility or the hope for a revival of our roots, where we can truly be a part of what has been made available to us with some sacrifice, all right? So tell me a little bit about that, Faith, the movement of youth historically, and how do we connect that to our political communication presently?
I want to draw from what everyone has said, but I also want to add in something. In looking at the literature before this, I had to scrape to find information about youth involvement in politics. You do not see much, it's not something highlighted. There's been movements to revise history to include women, and that's awesome, but not so much on the youth. There were some statistics of youth deaths in the labor riots, but you don't see historians or documentations highlighting the involvement of youth. So I just want to stick that in. But I like what Shane said about the advertisement to youth being intentional. I like that word that he said, intentional, because I believe back then there was this intentionality to target all persons because there was this struggle for enfranchisement. And I want to take from what you said, there's still struggles that the youth now have to face. There's climate change, there's the threats of globalization, there's so many other things as well, pure poverty, for example, and we can highlight and go on to many, many more. There's a digital divide, there's so many challenges that we still have to be intentional about. So I think if you want to talk about engaging the youth, you have to talk about being intentional. And there was that intentionality in the past because there was this fight for a struggle. I want to say that there still is a fight, there still is a struggle. Maybe we can word it differently, but I still think it is a struggle, and we need to be intentional with targeting the youth and saying, hey, this is also about you. We need to go to them through the community, through guilds, through civil society organizations, through all of the organizations or points that we can reach them. And I would add to him as well, I think that in the formation of the parliament and as it is now, it's more bureaucratic. And I think that lacks the transparency. You said that youth would go to the forums in public, they would engage with the trade unions, engage with the parties. Now it's more bureaucratic, right? You tune in to maybe the parliament channel, or yes, it is on social media, but I do not think there is that engagement. And maybe you can say it is because of the lack of intentionality or because of how bureaucratic it has become. Maybe it is both of those.
So to your point, Faith, Shanta, tell me, the struggle continues. That's what I'm hearing Faith saying. The struggle continues. We have evidence of some movement of youth vote, movement of youth involved in electoral politics, movement of women being involved in electoral politics. You know, I remember at some point it became a pride of conversation in Tobago, you know, to see Mr. Nigel De Freitas being elevated as the vice president of the Senate. I think he was around 36 years at that time, relatively young, you know. You see women involved in politics, in leadership position, decision-making position, be it the Speaker of the House. We're here, you know, at this prestigious institution. We, at one point in time, you know, we had a woman who was the President of the Senate, now President of the Republic. So my question to you is, how far are we on this journey, and what is required to take us to that next stage so that young persons aren't disenchanted or disengaged and women see themselves as part of the process?
You know what is interesting, when you look at the electorate, women make up 50% of the electorate. And another interesting point is when you look at the election results, we see at least 10,000 persons. Most elections and most constituencies do not go out to vote. And Shane mentioned something, you know, why hasn't the EBC been able to provide us with these statistics? Who are these persons? Male, female, older generation, younger generation? But coming to your question, where do we go as women in politics? I want to firstly commend the Parliament for allowing, you know, the Youth Parliament, these sessions to mentor us, to, you know, to prep us to take over. We are the future. We also saw there's the Women Parliamentary Network. I must commend the Parliament for that, and the Speaker of the House, where you bring in former parliamentarians, and that is important to keep everyone engaged, keep these women engaged together, because when you look on the party politics, on both sides, you see in the UNC, women in politics, they don't have that sustainability. every election you see women coming and going. Even on the PNM side, yes, women have been there for years, but have they been able to ascend to leadership positions? There are so many senior politicians on both sides, but we haven't been able to see that movement upward. Yes, we had our first female prime minister being a woman, but where did that really pave the way for women to continue thriving in politics? When you look also at how women are treated in politics, and it comes from both men and women. You would expect women to be another woman's keeper. But we don't see that. They are targeted, they are held at a higher standard, they are said, the most derogatory things. And our politics has to evolve, it has to change, and maybe it can allow further strides for women in politics.